Hello guys. Welcome back to another video. Today I got a special video. This is Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, which is by David Hume. Now, David Hume is one of my most favorite philosophers. I love this dude. I remember in school that I presented a slide on him for history, and I absolutely dominated that slide. And it was so fun. Well, I want to share you the specialty of Hume today. So, we're going to be covering sections 1 to 4 of his book, The Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, which will give you um, a basic, or not a basic, but a kind of in-depth brief into David Hume's like epistemology and his epistemic questions that raises serious devastating consequences, which you'll see he has a everlasting effect on contemporary philosophical works at least. All right, let's get started. Now, in the first section of the Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, it's just focusing up on moral philosophy, and he divides up the species of philosophy. So moral philosophy is also known as the science of human nature, and is approached in two ways. So the first way considers man as being born for action and is moral, which is kind of political, and this species of philosophy holds virtue as the most valuable thing, and they use literature or poetry to inspire or say move the heart and inspire love of goodness and encourage more behavior. So it's more apt to feelings basically. So they appeal to motion rather than abstract arguments like syllogisms. And Hume sees this as a valuable and a good way to promote virtue, right? While the other species considers man in the light of reason, that he is an animal of reason rather than an active being. And this species of philosophy aims at the understanding of man or his intellect, not his behavior or act. This species studies human nature through speculation, but they examine it with narrow scrutiny. And their goal is to find universal principles and deepen the understanding. Now, even if only a few truths are discovered for future thinkers, this type of species of philosophy is useful in that case. Now, eh, not a lot of people understand the second species of philosophy because this species like aims at the learned or educated. So the second species of philosophy would be something like metaphysics. And Hume says that the easy and obvious philosophy will always win over preference above the abstruse, which is the obscure philosophy, since it is one, more agreeable, and two, more useful or practical. And it touches more to the hearts of men and shapes them and guides them every day, while the abstruse philosophy really doesn't have any effect in real life actions. And once outside the study of that second species, the philosopher who studies it, his emotion and passions will overpower his theories, making him act like just a ordinary person, which Hume causes a plebeian, if I'm pronouncing that right. Now, Hume also says that the long lasting or durable philosophy is obviously the easy philosophy because a lot of people tend to choose that over the abstruse philosophy. While abstruse or abstract philosophers have only enjoyed a momentary reputation. The abstruse philosopher, says Hume, can easily be in error or can err easily. And one mistake leads to more, and it's very devastating because he's more focused on abstract thinking or logic, right? Over really common sense. But Hume says a philosopher who sticks close to common sense and natural feelings or everyday experience, it's safer if he errs, because he quickly corrects himself by returning to common sense and human sentiment, which avoids the serious consequences of what the abstruse philosopher does. Thus, Hume famously states that the fame of Cicero is presently flourishing, while that of Aristotle is decayed. Whoa, throwing shots at Aristotle now. And La Bruyere passes the seas and still maintains his reputation, but the glory of Malebranche, or Malebranche, if I'm even pronouncing that right, is confined to his own nation and to his own age. And Addison, perhaps, will be read with pleasure when Locke shall be entirely forgotten. Well, don't worry, Locke ain't gone. We still talk to him a lot. we still talk about him a lot today. So the philosopher, as a person, Hume says, is little acceptable in the world, practically a social reject. I know that sounds harsh. Yet the philosopher contributes nothing to society, and they speak in ways that most people don't even understand. Yet the ignorant person is even more despised. Um, but Hume says the ideal person is really just the mean between the philosophers, so somewhere in the middle between the philosopher and the ignorant person. They enjoy books, social life, and work, and have good taste, wisdom, and honesty. So don't like the so what Hume is saying, the ideal philosopher is one where they're not really too abstruse in their thought or abstract to the point that there's too much uncertainty and that leads to serious consequences, and they're not ignorant, right? Because you don't want to be dumb but yeah, so Hume says really the ideal person just lies in the middle, so just have a little bit of both, or have some of both, right? Because philosophy is to expose our ignorance. uh, uh, And so, oh, sorry, I think I skipped a slide. No, I didn't. So the ideal person is the one that makes virtue appealing, makes it inspiring, kind of touches the heart of men. He socializes meaningful, and he makes knowledge enjoyable. This character doesn't demand super in-depth comprehension and study, so it's not like you're reading Aristotle 10 times a day and you're just staying up for the rest of the night. I wish I could do that sometimes, but surely I cannot. Hume says that although man is proclaimed as a rational being, and that his food is science in a sense, the bounds of human understanding is so narrow, right? And that man, the man, which is the ideal thing, and he says that man is actually more rather a sociable being rather than a rational one, and he is also an active one. And just to note that Hume's philosophy or Hume's epistemology derives from his philosophy of the mind. And so Hume says that nature has pointed out a mixed life for us. He says a little bit of this and a little bit of that, right? And nature guides humans to live a balanced life. That means not just letting one passion just dominate your whole life. Nature says enjoy science, but keep it human and keep it related to society in real life. But nature, says she, forbids abstract or obscure or abstruse thought because it brings uncertainty, doubt, rejection, and loneliness. Thus Hume famously states, be a philosopher, but admits all your philosophy, be still a man, which just really means that keep your philosophy human level, basically, right? Still be a man in philosophy, right? And when he goes back to saying, nature warns us not to go into abstruse thought, is because it leads to real uncertainty, and it leads to devastating consequences. Now, since most people pick the easy philosophy over the abstruse philosophy, one which is also known as metaphysics, as I've seen, Hume says, well, let's give it a chance and let's see its value, right? Let's go examine it. And so Hume says that abstract philosophy is important in one way, and that is that it serves the easy and humane philosophy. Without abstract philosophy, we can never obtain a degree of exactness of sentiments, precepts, and reasoning. Just like an artist needs knowledge of anatomy to paint beautiful figures, writers need understanding of the mind, passions, and sentiments to accurately portray human life. So in this way, when Hume says that abstract philosophy is useful, it is useful in the assistance of the easy and humane philosophy. And so Hume says that both abstract philosophy or deep reasoning and easy philosophy, they're both needed, right? They work together and they complement each other. So we shouldn't, put one down to value the other. But Hume says careful, accurate thinking improves all professions and benefits society. So this is another way abstract philosophy is helpful. Even the genius of philosophy influenced politicians, lawyers, and generals to be more wiser, I just made a grammatical mistake. More wiser doesn't make sense because wiser implies more. And generals to be wiser and more effective. That is why modern governments are more stable than past ones. Now, even if abstract study only satisfy curiosity or wonder, it's still valuable and it's a harmless pleasure, right? Learning is one of life's safest joys, and those who make it easier or clearer will help humanity. Though it is difficult, right? Some minds, they flourish on such things, and they are able to find happiness in turning obscurity into understanding. But the obscurity in abstract philosophy, it's just so painful, Hume says. It leads to uncertainty and error. And Hume believes that part of metaphysics isn't a science. It comes from the fruitless efforts of humans that make subjects unintelligible to reasoning, or from superstitions that are not able to be justified by reason on fair grounds. And Hume thinks one example of this is religion. He says when it is challenged, it retreats to obscure arguments that overwhelm the mind with religious fears or prejudices. Many, out of fear or foolishness, accept these ideas unquestioningly, treating them like rightful lords or kings. Hume's goal is clear then. He says, and must cultivate true metaphysics with some care in order to destroy the false and adulterate. So he wants to destroy the false metaphysics. Hume says, philosophers should keep questioning superstitions, and that only accurate and just reasoning is the medicine for all people, and is alone able to destroy the abstruse philosophy and metaphysical jargon that is mixed with superstition, which poses itself as, science and wisdom. Thus, Hume believes that the operations of our mind are obscure, but if they're known, this is one of the most valuable knowledge you can have. And Hume says that it is not possible to doubt that the mind has some several powers and faculties, and that they are distinct from each other, and that there is a truth and falsehood in every proposition of this subject, and truth or falsehood that is able to be understood by humans. Hume says there are varying distinctions that are comprehended by every human, like will and understanding, and these are just kind of obvious. But he also says there are some that are just more harder to comprehend, though they are no less real. Alright, this is where we get to section 2, which is one of the fun parts. Hume, in this section, is going to be talking about the origin of our idea. So you're going to get into an insight of an empiricism right here, right? So first, Hume divides all our perceptions into two things. One, ideas or thoughts. These are the less vivid. For example, they are the memories or ideas that come from imagination. They also involve thinking and reasoning and reflecting about something. However, two, impressions. These are the most vivid. For example, these are feelings and sensations like loving, hating, and willing. Like you get the impression of a table. Hume wants to prove which ideas are grounded in experience and which is not. He wants to uncover where all our ideas come from. And so how are these two distinct, Hume asks, or you might ask? Hume says they're really just distinct by their vividness. Literally just their vividness. And so all our beliefs are based on impressions of experience. Since experience gives us impressions, we can form less vivid ideas and create complex perceptions like a unicorn or impression. So from impressions, we get ideas, and then we could just take this idea of gold and this idea of mountain, and we just, boom, gold mountain, right? And so Hume says that although it appears that our minds are limitless or unbounded because it can form concepts beyond reality like dragons or goblins, he actually says it seems that it seems like nothing is beyond the power of thought except what entails a contradiction, because contradiction implies impossibility already. But Hume actually says that if you look very closely, our minds are actually very limited, and that our creative power really just comes from augmenting, compounding, transposing, or diminishing the data we get from the senses. So we're limited to what the senses can give us. Now Hume gives us the example, as I've said, of a gold mountain. When we think of a gold mountain, we just join two ideas, and that is gold and mountain, with what we acquainted prior from sense data, right? Likewise, he says we can conceive of a virtuous horse via our own feelings, and this is where he gets a little bit into his moral philosophy, though he doesn't even mention it here. But I'll just tell you that he's like a moral subjectivist or a moral sentimentalist. He believes that the foundation of our morality really just comes from sentiment, right? For example, if I say that murder is wrong, he would say that's just how I feel, not in the action itself. That feeling or that concept of bad is not in the object itself or the action, but in me. And so he says we are able to conceive virtue from our own feelings, and then we unite such idea to that of a horse. Thus Hume says that all the material in our mind are derived from inward or outward sentiment. In other words, Hume is saying that every idea are copies of impressions. This is known as Hume's copy principle. Hume proves this with two arguments. The first argument is that whenever we look at our thoughts or ideas or we analyze them, no matter how complicated they are and composed they always seem to be reduced into simple ideas being copied from a sentiment or feeling. Hume takes the example of the idea of God, meaning something infinitely intelligent, wise, and good being. It seems that we cannot create this idea of God, and we can't really get this idea of God from sense data, right? Because he's infinite. Now, Hume argues that the concept of God really just comes from when we reflect on our own minds and then we augment, right? Augment just means you're adding on without, and then he says we're augmenting without limit. So adding on without limit, which includes qualities like goodness and wisdom. And so the second is that every idea we analyze is copied from an impression. But Hume says that this principle can be easily refuted if one just presents an idea that wasn't derived from sense. However, to this principle, Hume does allow one exception. He says, suppose someone has seen every shade of blue except one shade of blue. If he was shown all the other shades in a gradient, they might notice the gap and imagine the missing shade. This means that it is possible, but in unique and very rare cases, to form an idea without a direct impression. But Hume says this case is so exceptional and little that it doesn't really refute the general rule. Other than that, Hume argues that a blind man could form no conception of color and a deaf man no conception of sound. But if you were to restore those senses, you open an inlet of ideas, and then they can form a conception now. So we have no conceptions of things if they have never been presented to us as ideas. And an idea can only have access to the mind via experience or sensation. So if Hume's principle is correct, that every idea has a corresponding impression, it will destroy all the false metaphysical jargon, which you'll see this principle has a very, very devastating consequence here. Thus, Hume says that abstract ideas are very obscure. The mind really just has a slender hold of them, meaning they don't really have a tight or strong hold of them. We often mistake vague ideas for meaningful ones, especially when using familiar terms without clear understanding. But Hume says that all sensations are vivid and strong, and their limits are more determined, and they are less prone to error. I have terrible grammar today, and they're less prone. It's supposed to, and they are less prone. And thus, Hume says that if we ever suspect a philosophical term or any term of being really just meaningless, we should ask, what impression does this idea come from? And if none can be found, our suspicions shall be confirmed that the idea is likely meaningless. Now in section 3, Hume says that there is a natural principle in the mind that connects our thoughts, and it is too obvious to escape observation that different ideas are connected. Hume doesn't really want to explain this much, he just states, And so Hume introduces us to what is known as the association principle, which governs all our thoughts. Basically what that means is just connects our ideas. So, which is resemblance, contiguity, which is ideas that have been experienced together in space or time and are often associated, and 3, causation. Now, section 4 is where the real fun begins. First, Hume begins by dividing all objects of human reason into two species. 1, matters of fact, and 2, relations of ideas. So relations of ideas are a priori, which is knowledge independent of empirical justification. This include mathematics, geometry, algebra, basically every affirmation that is by intuition certain or demonstratively certain, and that their denial entails a contradiction, and they don't depend on how the world is for their truth or falsity. For example, a squared plus b squared equals c squared is true demonstratively, right? Even if no human were to exist, and denying it would entail a contradiction, Hume says. And another example he gives is that 30 divided by 2 is the same as 3 times 5, which is true. These propositions then, Hume says, are discoverable by mere thought, while matters of fact are the second objects of human reason. Matters of fact are things that can be denied without contradiction, and they depend on how the world is for its truth, and they're possible, and they're known as posteriori, which is knowledge dependent on empirical justification. So that the sun will not rise tomorrow is no less intelligible a proposition and implies no more contradiction than the affirmation that it will rise. So one, the contrary is possible for every matter of fact since it never implies a contradiction. And two, it depends on the world for its truth or falsity. So for example, Socrates is sitting. Really just depends on Socrates and the world, right? Or that the sun will rise tomorrow is a matter of fact. Now, Hume starts to examine what evidence assures us of reality beyond sense and memory. And Hume comes to find that all reasonings of matters of fact is founded on the relation of cause and effect. Hume says by that relation can we go beyond the evidence of our memories and senses. And Hume says if you ask a man why he believe a matter of fact not present, he will give another fact as a reason, like a letter or past promise from his friend. And so all factual reasoning works this way, assuming a connection between what's known and what's inferred. Another example is that a man finding a watch or any other machine in a deserted island would conclude that there had once been men in that island. And if nothing binded facts together, then no inference would ever actually be made. So the relation of cause and effect can either be made near or remote, direct or collateral. So Hume says that heat and light are the collateral effects of fire, and the other effect can be inferred from the other. But if matters of fact are based on the relation of cause and effect, we must examine how do we know that relation? How do we know cause and effect, right? And Hume first of all, clearly, that the relation of cause and effect is never going to be attained through a priori means. So this is a refutation of rationalists, which is independent of experience or empirical justification, and there is no exception to this at all. It must come from experience. And Hume says such relation only arises from experience. Hume says that when we find any particular objects that constantly are conjoined together, no matter how sharp a man's reason is, even if we suppose that he had the most perfect faculty of reason, if that object is entirely new to him, he cannot, by just examining its quality, discover its causes or effects. For example, if I look at, let's see a good example. Let's say if I see water, right? I cannot just immediately tell, even if I had the highest intelligence in the world, I cannot just, if that object was new to me, I could not tell that it will nourish me or that it will suffocate or drown me, right? And he says, no matter how sharp a man's reason, if an object is entirely new to him, he cannot, by examining its quality, discover its causes or effects. Even if a man had perfect rational faculties, he cannot have inferred the fluidity and transparency of water that it could suffocate him or from fire that would burn him. That is because no object ever reveals its causes or effects through its sensible qualities, and reason alone without experience cannot infer matters of fact. So this proposition that causes and effects are discoverable not by reason but by experience. Hume says that no man can imagine matters of fact, like that the explosion of gunpowder could be discovered by arguments a priori or independent of experience. Hume says we often think familiar events, like a billiard ball moving another, could be known by reason alone without experience. But this is customs effect, and it hides our ignorance so well that we forget it's there. So it's because we've seen so many times that we've seen a billiard ball moving another that we infer a causal connection, right? And so this is what I mean by Hume's epistemology really comes from Hume's psychology or philosophy of the mind. And so Hume holds that knowing all the laws of nature and all the operations of the bodies entirely depend on experience with no exception. Hume asks us, let's say an object was presented to you and you were required to say what its effect is without any past observation at all. How can the mind ever come to such effect? The mind either must 1. Invent such notion, or 2. Imagine some event which ascribes to the object as its effect. But notice the problem here. The invention or imagination of the mind is entirely arbitrary or subjective, right? It holds no value. It's really just ad hoc. And Hume makes it clear for us. The mind can never possibly discover the effect in the present cause. The effect is totally different from the cause and can never be discovered in it. And here comes the famous example of the billiard ball. So we have billiard ball 1, and then we see it moving towards billiard ball number 2, and then we see billiard ball number 2 moving. Hume says billiard two balls motion is a very distinct event from the first billiard ball's motion. And the first billiard ball's motion tells us nothing about the second billiard ball's motion. When I see one billiard ball moving toward another, I might expect the second to move, but I can also imagine many other outcomes. That is, both could stop, the first could bounce back, or move off in another direction. All these possibilities are logically conceivable and imply no contradiction. So why do we expect one outcome over the others? Hume says there is no reason a priori before experience to favor one. Our reasoning alone can't justify that expectation. Now, in nature, without experience, Hume says, all operations of human understanding are arbitrary, basically. When one billiard ball strikes another, we can conceive countless outcomes. But why do we prefer the one over the other, right? And as I've already said, a priori reasoning can never give any ground for this. So then again, Hume says that every effect is a distinct event from its cause, and could never be discovered in the cause itself. And the invention or conception of it via a priori is totally subjective or arbitrary. Even after an effect is suggested, its conjunction to the cause seems arbitrary, right? Because we only see a conjunction of events. And he says, since many other outcomes appear just as possible, but without experience, we can infer no cause or effect. And Hume says that the furthest thing that human reason reaches is to reduce particular phenomena to a few general principles like gravity, elasticity, or impulse from experience, observation, and analogy. But the causes of these general principles remain entirely hidden from us, and so the best natural philosophy only delays our ignorance a little bit, and while moral and metaphysical philosophy often reveals even more of it. In the end, the recognition of human weakness is the inevitable, inescapable conclusion of all of philosophy. That's deep, right? And so, Hume says, when we look into causation, we find four components. One is that the idea of a constant conjunction of cause and effect. Whenever the cause occurs, the effect follows. Second, the idea of the temporal priority of the cause, which is the cause happens first, then the effects, or the effect. And third, the idea of causes and effects being contiguous next to each other in space and time. And fourthly, the idea of a necessary connection between the cause and the effect. Here is Hume's challenge. All reasonings concerning matter of fact seem to be founded on the relation of cause and effect. By means of that relation alone can we go beyond the evidence of our memory and senses. Hume says, there is no such thing as we observing causality or necessary causation. All we ever actually observe is a conjunction of events, meaning we see event A then B, but we do not have knowledge of necessary connection. Our minds are disposed, remember Hume's philosophy of the mind, our minds are so disposed to think we see a cause due to habit and custom. Hume says because you've seen a ball hit another ball, and the ball moved a lot of times, you form a belief of causality. And the more conjoined A and B, the more probable or degree of causation you think there is, or that there is, right? And so this idea of necessary connection is really a metaphysical concept. He says not founded on impressions. Necessary connection is saying that if X causes Y, then if X occurs, so does Y, and that X has this power to bring Y into existence. Hume says when you see another billiard ball move another billiard ball, and you say that this billiard ball caused this billiard ball to move necessarily, you're saying that there's some connection. But Hume asks us, where do you observe this connection? You have no impression of it. Therefore, it's just utterly meaningless. We cannot move from the observed to the unobserved. That is the shown qualities or the sensible qualities to hidden qualities. Like, for example, bread, the fact that bread nourishes us is a hidden quality, right? It's not observable. And so Hume says, so we have no reason for why a cause necessitates its effect. All we see is event A and B, and it's never contradictory to assume that maybe a different outcome could result. And no a priori reason ever disproves this as well. Obviously, Hume says no. We can never observe such necessary connection. We have no impression of it. All we ever see is the conjunction of events, but because we've seen it so many times, we form a belief of causation via habit and custom and habit. That is why we posit necessary connections. Question: what about myself? If I move my hand, can't I just say that it caused my hand to move, right? Because it's me, right? It seems immediate. Hume says that even this does not work because you're still seeing a conjunction. You're just observing, you're not observing the connection between you and your hand, right? There's no connection between the will and your hand. And so causation as a constant conjunction to us, Hume concedes, but as a necessary connection, Hume denies. Even mathematics, says Hume, like geometry, when it's mixed with natural philosophy, is not able to lead us into the knowledge of ultimate causes. Even, every part of mathematics that is mixed with natural philosophy operates upon a supposition that certain laws are established in nature. Abstract reasoning helps either to support experience in discovering laws or to measure their effects in specific cases involving exact distances and quantities. But laws like a law of motion is discovered by reason. But laws like the a law of motion is discovered by experience. Although geometry assists us in the application of these laws, but the discovery of the law itself is always going to be attributed to experience. So no amount of abstract a priori reasoning can reveal the connection between a cause and its effect without prior experience. One cannot logically deduce that heat produces crystal or cold produces ice without first observing it. Now in section 4, part 2, Hume says that we haven't answered what was proposed. How do we get knowledge of the relation of cause and effect? And he says, as each solution leads to deeper, equally difficult questions, our reasonings about matters of fact is based on cause and effect, and that in turn relies on experience. But if we ask what justifies conclusions from experience, we face a very hard question, or a very, very hard, more difficult question. Hume says, philosophers who give themselves the air of superior wisdom have a hard time when they encounter people who push them from every corner and ask hard questions, to which these philosophers start to retreat. Hume says that even after we experience cause and effect, our conclusions from that experience are not based on reasoning or any operation of understanding. Nature has naturally or surely hidden some of her secrets distant from us, although some has been revealed to us. But nature hides the powers and principles on which these objects totally rely on. Nature really holds back the abstract why, right? And our senses might tell us the color, weight, and texture of bread, but neither sense nor reason can explain what makes it nourish the body truly. We see and feel motion, but the force that keeps a body moving or transfers when it stops is beyond our understanding. Despite our ignorance, though, of natural powers, we assume that similar visible qualities imply similar hidden powers. So when we see bread that looks like what we've eaten before, we confidently expect it to nourish us in the same way. This is the working of the mind, that the future will be like the past, which is, in other words, induction. Now, everyone agrees there's no known connection or link between visible qualities and hidden powers, so our minds aren't really drawing conclusions based on any real knowledge of their nature. Experience tells us about what we've directly observed, so, experience basically experience tells us that a thing is, not what something really is in of itself. Now, it only tells us about what is directly observed, not about the future or seemingly similar objects. So the real question is, why do we extend past observed things to unobserved things? Why do we move from the observed to the unobserved? Is such inference actually valid? So, this bread I formerly consumed nourished me, but Hume asks, does it follow that other bread must also nourish me at another time, and like sensible qualities are attended to with like secret powers? Hume says, no, it is not necessary, but that there is a step drawn mentally from our mind. And by the way, secret powers here just means hidden qualities that are unseen or unobservable. So these two propositions are far from being the same. I have found that such an object has always been attended with such an effect, and I foresee that other objects which are in appearance similar will be attended with similar effects. Hume argues that the connection between the two propositions is not intuitive at all. Furthermore, Hume divides all reasoning into two kinds. First is moral reasoning, which concerns matters of fact, and two, demonstrative or demonstrative reasoning, which concerns relations of ideas. Hume argues that there is no demonstrative argument against the idea that nature might change, because it's really just a matter of fact since it never implies a contradiction that the future might change, right? How do I know the next time I jump that I won't just randomly fly up to the moon, right? Gravity, right? And so Hume says that whatever is intelligible and can be distinctly conceived is possible. It implies no contradiction and is impossible to be proved otherwise by a priori arguments, demonstrative arguments, or abstract reasoning. Consider this argument. the sun has risen every day in the past, therefore the sun will rise tomorrow. That is an example of an inductive argument or a moral reasoning. Oops, sorry. But Hume argues that such arguments are only probable, since it puts its trust into past experience to judge the future. Arguments regarding real existence or matters of fact are probable and rely on the relation of cause and effect. And our knowledge of cause and effect all comes from experience, and that all our conclusions from experience already presuppose that the future will be like the past. So this really asks us the question, how do we prove that the future will be like the past? Hume says, to try to justify or prove such a claim, this is also known as the problem of induction, by the way. Hume says to try to justify or prove such a claim by saying, because in the past the future has been like the past, or using any probable argument, or arguments regarding existence, will evidently be going into circular reasoning, because all arguments from experience rely on noticing similarities in nature, which lead us to expect similar effects from similar objects. From causes which appear similar, we expect, by the mind, similar effects. And from a number of experiences, we infer a connection between observable or sensible qualities to secret powers that are hidden or unseen qualities. But this is also the same difficulty, because on what process is this argument in such inference found? And if you were to have such an argument, then Hume asks you to produce it or show it. So the sensible qualities of a thing, like color, appear to have no connection to the secret powers. With bread, for example, nourishment. Otherwise, we'd infer such secret powers from the appearances from the sensible qualities when we see it. Experience can only show us that certain objects had certain effects at specific times. But when we see a new object with similar visible qualities, we expect similar hidden powers and effects. But this mental leap needs explanation. Thus Hume says, when a man says, I have found, in all past inferences, such sensible qualities conjoined with such secret powers, and when he says similar sensible qualities will always be conjoined with similar secret powers, he is not guilty of a tautology, nor are these propositions in any respect the same. The latter is an inference, but not an intuitive or demonstrable one. Saying it is experimental just begs the question, because all experience or experiment assumes the future will resemble the past. If nature could change, then guess what? Past experience would be useless, right? Then you can't appeal to experience to justify such principle. It begs the question, it assumes the thing you're trying to prove. So no argument from experience can ever prove the future will be like the past, since such arguments already assume that. Now, even if things have always behaved consistently before, that alone doesn't guarantee that it will continue. Hidden powers could change without any change in visible qualities. This sometimes happens, so why can it always happen? So far, so devastating to the epistemology, to epistemology as a whole. Hume's reasoning and how we get knowledge and his empiricism totally at some level destroys the possibility of knowledge. And so to conclude section 4, the supposition that the future will be like the past does not come from reasoning that makes us suppose such thing. Hume says that even the simplest people, that are infants and animals, they learn from experience, like a child avoiding a hot candle after getting burned. But if you say that this learning comes from reasoning, then you ought to show such argument, since it is obvious even to infants. Thus, it cannot be a complex argument. Thus, we have shown the problem of induction and the problem of causation or skepticism of causation from Hume and his basic his basic empiricism. Right? Remember, he kind of considers metaphysical statements utterly meaningless because they can never trace back to a simple impression. So Hume's epistemic criteria is that an idea must correspond to a impression, or an idea must have a corresponding impression. And that's basically it for sections 1 to 4. Thank you. Have a good day.